Warning: this video will contain spoilers for all 3 seasons of The White Lotus. In its 3rd season, The White Lotus has been exploring the tendency of the wealthy, the white, and the Western to seek spiritual awakening through travel abroad. Our culture unquestioningly accepts the notion that travelers return home more educated, cultured, and enlightened than when they departed. But through the last 3 seasons of The White Lotus, creator Mike White has asked us to reconsider this notion. As we watch what little personal and relational growth the guests experience come at the cost of the labor and sometimes the lives of the lower classes and locals. The White Lotus draws us into its lush resorts only to reveal the rot beneath their pristine surfaces. While recent years have seen a surge of media satirizing the wealthy, what critics have dubbed the eat the rich genre, White's approach transcends formulaic class commentary through its layered symbolism and anthropological depth.
I mean, every symbol has a meaning. It's the collective unconscious.
My obsession with the show has taken me down many rabbit holes. In order to understand the themes and motifs in this show, I have delved into history, psychology, economics, anthropology, literary theory, and I'm here to unpack, so to speak, what I've learned. I've come to identify 5 interconnected themes that will help us understand why this show, on the surface a soapy and sexy farce, feels like it resonates at a deeper register in this cultural moment. We'll examine how Mike White uses his characters to demonstrate how capitalism has transformed our moral frameworks, shifting our focus from solidarity with others towards being true to ourselves, a concept that the Buddhist teachings highlighted in this season ultimately reveal to be circular and incoherent. We'll explore how ancient moral codes and sacred rituals continue to haunt the margins of luxury tourist destinations like the White Lotus resorts, where relationships that once had spiritual significance have been hollowed out into purely transactional encounters. Third, we'll unpack the uncomfortable colonial history that underpins global tourism, revealing how these guests arrive at the resort with a history and context that is obscured by its luxurious surfaces, but that ultimately breaks through with almost mythic vengeance. Fourth, we'll decode the show's powerful visual language, those observant monkey statues and threatening waves that hint at both the fragility of human hierarchies and the revolutionary forces that might dissolve them. And finally, we'll put capitalism on the couch, exploring how the show uses themes from Freudian psychoanalysis to critique the emotional and psychological aspects of our current system by demonstrating how they reflect through individual characters' psychologies. Throughout it all, we'll be answering one key question: why can't we look away from these terrible people doing terrible things in beautiful places? What does our fascination with the misadventures of the wealthy reveal about our complicated relationship with the very system that both oppresses and seduces us? Along the way, I'll give my take on some of the most controversial aspects of this season, like Sam Rockwell's monologue about wanting to be an Asian girl, the incestuous brothers situation, and perhaps the biggest question: is the show effective satire or just another salacious distraction? So grab a drink, maybe something with a little umbrella in it, and let's dive in. Authentically amoral. Just as threshold crossings have lost their sacred character, personal promises and social obligations have been hollowed out by a new moral framework that prioritizes individual authenticity over collective responsibility. This shift didn't occur in isolation, but emerged hand in hand with capitalism's reorganization of social and economic life. Understanding this transition helps explain why the character relationships in The White Lotus feel simultaneously familiar and deeply uncomfortable, as they embody the moral contradictions of contemporary capitalism. In The Origin of Capitalism, A Longer View, Ellen Meiskins Wood describes how the shift from feudalism to capitalism required not just economic changes, but profound cultural and moral transformations, particularly in how people related to land, labor, and each other. She doesn't romanticize feudal life, which was often brutally difficult with its own forms of exploitation and oppression. Peasants lived under the constant threat of violence and extraction from lords. Yet their relationship to subsistence differed qualitatively from capitalist wage labor. Peasants had customary rights to land despite not owning it in the modern sense, providing a form of economic security that didn't depend on selling their labor. Markets existed, but they operated within moral economies with concepts of fair price and communal obligation, limiting purely profit-seeking behavior. The transition to capitalism in England required the systematic dismantling of these pre-modern social relations through enclosure movements, as I discussed in my previous video, and the creation of a landless working class who had no choice but to sell their labor. This transformation from a moral economy to market society has continued to evolve through different stages of capitalism. The relative social protections of the New Deal capitalism, or Fordism, gave way to neoliberalism in the 1970s and 80s. Neoliberalism, a political and economic philosophy that emphasizes deregulation, privatization, and the primacy of market solutions over state intervention, has fundamentally reshaped our social relations. It's characterized by the dismantling of public services, weakening labor protections, and elevation of individual choice and personal responsibility over collective welfare. While neoliberalism remains the dominant ideology structuring our political economy today, its manifestations have evolved in more recent history. Some scholars argue we're seeing the emergence of new forms of capitalism, whether characterized as platform capitalism, surveillance capitalism, or even what Varoufakis calls techno-feudalism, though these exist within rather than fully replacing the neoliberal framework. Each transition required not just new technologies or business models, but active restructuring of social norms and expectations. The sharing economy of modern tourism platforms like Airbnb, for instance, required normalizing commodification of private homes and personal hospitality, concepts that would have seemed bizarre or even sacrilegious to earlier generations. Another striking example of this modern shift is our relationship with social media and personal privacy. For most of human history, deliberately courting public attention and exposing private life was seen as dangerous, inviting the evil eye or divine punishment for ostentatiousness. Many cultures developed elaborate systems to protect against excessive visibility, from physical amulets to behavioral taboos against boasting. Today, we not only accept but reward the constant performance of private life for public consumption. Social media influencers turn their intimate moments into content, effectively monetizing what previous generations would have carefully guarded. This transformation required not just technological innovation, but a profound recalibration of cultural values around privacy, visibility, and what constitutes appropriate self-disclosure. Similarly, the gig economy represents another transformative shift in social relations. The conversion of neighbors helping each other, governed by reciprocity and community obligation, into monetized TaskRabbit transactions required normalizing the idea that every human capacity, from driving someone to the airport to assembling furniture, should be priced and marketed. What was once embedded in social relations, governed by moral obligations, has been extracted into discrete services with monetary values. The success of companies like DoorDash doesn't just reflect technological innovation, but a cultural transformation where paying strangers for immediately disposable labor relationships has replaced systems of mutual aid and ongoing social obligation. Another example of how morality has changed alongside changes in economics was described by the literary theorist Lionel Trilling, who traced the shift from a regime of sincerity, being honest and honorable in one's dealings with others by keeping promises and one's word, to one of authenticity, being true to ourselves, whether or not that conflicts with our duties to others.
Remember who you are. Remember who you are.
Why not that voice inside is who you
Trilling traced this transformation through literature, beginning with this fascinating close reading of Polonius's famous advice to Laertes in Hamlet, "To thine own self be true." While today we tend to read this line as an early endorsement of authenticity, be true to your inner nature, follow your heart, Trilling points out that this is extremely anachronistic. We're viewing that line through our own modern cultural lens. The full quote is,
This above all, to thine own self be true. And it must follow as the night the day, thou canst not then be false to any man.
The focus here is actually on not being false to any man. Being true to yourself is essentially instrumental towards being sincere in your social dealings, a way of making sincerity easier by taking away the strain of having to hold up a social mask. Modern adaptations of Jane Austen also reveal this shift in moral frameworks and how they handle promises and social obligations. In the 2005 Pride and Prejudice, the Tom Wambsgans one, there's an incredible scene in which Dame Judi Dench and Keira Knightley read each other for filth in the Regency style, which if you've seen this movie, this scene probably lives rent-free in your head.
Let me be understood. Mr. Darcy is engaged to my daughter. Now what have you to say?
Only this, if that is the case, you can have no reason to suppose he would make an offer to me.
You selfish girl. This union has been planned since their infancy. Do you think it can be prevented by a young woman of inferior birth whose own sister's elopement resulted in a scandalously patched-up marriage, only achieved at the expense of your uncle. Heaven and earth, are the shades of Pemberley to be thus polluted?
But this scene changes something from the original novel that, as a modern audience, we really don't notice, but would cause Austen fangirlies circa 1813 to lose their absolute minds. The 2005 version changes Lady Catherine de Bourgh's original statement that Darcy and Anne have been intended for each other since infancy into an explicit claim that Mr. Darcy is engaged to my daughter, upgrading a family expectation into a formal engagement that must be broken for love to triumph. Modern audiences don't blink at this addition because we see breaking such promises in pursuit of authentic feeling as moral rather than dishonorable. Pretty much every character in The White Lotus, like most of us today, is insincere. Characters routinely sacrifice sincerity, Belinda lying about spa bookings, Armand lying about the pineapple suite, Harper's silent complicity with Ethan grabbing her leg under the table, showing minimal concern for interpersonal responsibility. Take the storyline in season 1 involving Tanya and Belinda. Tanya encourages Belinda to believe that they will go into business together.
Have you ever thought about starting like your own business?
Come on.
I would be down for funding something like that.
In so doing, she's essentially continuing with the harmful pattern she learned from her deceased mother, using money to purchase relationships.
She took her money and she manipulated people with it.
By the end of the season, Tanya decides to break the pattern and not go through with the venture that her heart was not really in, handing Belinda a stack of cash instead of the promised partnership. Under the regime of sincerity, Tanya's actions would be judged primarily by her breaking an implied promise and harming her reputation as an honest person.
You are so negative.
But looked at through the modern regime of authenticity, her dishonesty towards Belinda becomes secondary to what's portrayed as more morally significant, her personal growth journey away from harmful patterns. The authenticity framework doesn't eliminate the fact that she was dishonest in her dealings, rather it reorders moral priorities so that being true to her own feelings and not forcing herself into commitments she isn't passionate about takes precedence over keeping promises to others. The show thus illustrates how our contemporary moral framework subordinates questions of interpersonal honesty to the pursuit of authentic self-realization. The trio of childhood friends, Jacqueline, Kate, and Laurie, who creator Mike White refers to as the Big Blonde Blob, evokes one of Western art's most enduring mythological scenarios, the Judgment of Paris. In this Greek myth, Paris was asked to award a golden apple to the most beautiful of three goddesses, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. Each goddess offered Paris bribes, power, military prowess, or the most beautiful woman in the world, turning beauty into a competition with far-reaching consequences, eventually triggering the Trojan War. Similarly, the BBB exists in a constant state of comparison and judgment, though with a crucial modern twist. There's no external Paris figure needed to instigate their competition. Instead, they've internalized the judging gaze and now perform it on themselves and each other. Their interactions demonstrate how market values have colonized intimate relationships. They constantly assess each other's value through beauty, wealth, and status. These women perform friendship while secretly undermining each other, representing the insincerity that capitalism fosters in social relations. One thing to notice about the regime of sincerity, it's always much clearer what the right thing to do is under this regime than the regime of authenticity. The older system had characteristics that the sociologist Emile Durkheim identified as social integration or social solidarity, a state where strong collective bonds create stable, widely understood norms that guide behavior. By contrast, we now live in conditions that Durkheim would recognize as conditions of anomie, rapidly changing technological landscapes, accelerating information flows, volatile markets, and constant pressure for personal reinvention. In such circumstances, fixed moral codes based on sincerity struggle to provide guidance, while authenticity's emphasis on internal truth-seeking appears to offer a more adaptable moral framework, albeit one with less clarity about right action. This is part of why the rise of capitalism went hand in hand with an unprecedented expansion of legal infrastructure, both in the sheer volume of codified laws and in the scope of human activities subject to legal oversight. As a generalization, this legal apparatus exists to deal with situations in which social norms and trust alone are insufficient. Contract law, which developed extensively alongside market economies, is fundamentally concerned with formalizing what happens when promises are broken between parties. In the marketplace, we need to be able to break promises on a dime to take advantage of the next big opportunity. This mercenary approach to relationships has infected our social world, birthing an ethos of ruthless self-management where promises crumble before the prospect of trading up, whether for a more advantageous romantic partner or friends who better reflect our carefully curated self-image. This contradiction creates an impossible situation for modern people, as sociologist Hartmut Rosa perfectly described in his book Resonance. Under the highly dynamic conditions of late modernity, the task of finding our authentic selves collides with the socio-cultural demand to be constantly reinventing or rebranding ourselves. That this reinvention should simultaneously be completely authentic is one of the more pointed paradoxes of our age. When yourself is treated as something fluid and endlessly adaptable, it loses substantive content, becoming a pure branding exercise. For example, many of the trends we see on social media aren't truly about authenticity, they're about identity commodification. Take the popular discourse around being a homebody or having social anxiety. What might start as a genuine recognition of traits that were suppressed in childhood quickly transforms into a marketable identity package. You discover you're uncomfortable at parties, and suddenly algorithms serve you endless introvert content that affirms this as your immutable, authentic self. The insidious part is how this flattens complex personhood into simplified labels that can be monetized from both directions. First, content creators sell you affirmation that your social battery drainage is a fixed aspect of your identity, requiring rigid boundaries. Then, inevitably, the dialectic flips and someone sells you the breakthrough course on embracing your hidden extrovert energy. But notice what's missing in this entire cycle: any consideration beyond the self. This commodified authenticity never asks how your choices affect others or what moral responsibilities you might have regardless of your preferences. Instead, capitalism transforms what could be meaningful self-discovery into endless navel-gazing that's always primarily concerned with consumption and performance rather than connection or social obligation. Your authentic self becomes whichever version of yourself happens to be the most marketable at the moment.
You have a bad case of something called mimetic desire.
In a system where authenticity is something we must perform and optimize, self-expression becomes indistinguishable from self-interest. The pressure to constantly be yourself while also staying desirable, relevant, and marketable creates a kind of hyper-individualism that blurs the line between genuine selfhood and selfishness. Looking back at the example of Tanya, her pursuit of authenticity becomes difficult to distinguish from simple selfishness.
You hate me, don't you?
And it's this collapse of the concept of selfishness and authentic selfhood which ultimately reflects the defining feature of Homo economicus, or the way that capitalism views human nature. Under this model, self-interest isn't just one aspect of being human, it becomes synonymous with authentic selfhood itself. Season 3's Buddhist teachings fundamentally challenge Western authenticity culture. When Amrita asks us to see identity as a prison, she exposes authenticity's contradiction. If there is no permanent self, what exactly are we being authentic to? The entire project becomes circular and hollow. The Buddhists would see our exhausting efforts to discover and express our true selves as a form of suffering, attachment to an illusion that keeps us trapped in cycles of desire and disappointment. Chelsea's reliance on astrology and the Enneagram represents modern Western attempts to understand and categorize the self through consumer-friendly frameworks. These systems provide ready-made identities that can be tried on like products. I'm a Scorpio, or I'm an Enneagram Type 4.
In the Enneagram, I'm a 9. I'm easygoing, peacemaker. But it also means I'm quite complacent, which isn't always good. Hey, you're probably a 2.
This commodification of identity stands in direct opposition to Buddhism's teaching that attachment to a fixed self is the source of suffering. Oh my god, I'm probably losing the astrology girlies right here so bad. Sorry, girls. Rick's dismissive, mean-spirited response to Chelsea's concerns about their astrological compatibility shows another aspect of capitalism's approach to identity.
How can you be my soulmate? Our signs aren't even compatible.
The cynical rejection of meaning-making systems while offering nothing to replace them.
What's your system of belief, Olivia? Not capitalism, not socialism, so just cynicism?
In this conversation, Rick embodies nihilistic consumption without belief, while Chelsea represents consumption through belief systems that ultimately reinforce, rather than dissolve, ego attachments. Interestingly, while Buddhism undermines authenticity, it actually aligns more naturally with the older regime of sincerity that Trilling describes. Sincere action, being honest and honorable in one's dealings with others, keeping promises, and maintaining social harmony requires no fixed inner self to reference. It simply asks that one's words and actions align with one another and with basic ethical principles. The Buddhist emphasis on right speech, right action, and right livelihood in the Noble Eightfold Path could be seen as a form of sincerity ethics that refuses the problematic notion of an authentic self. This offers a striking contrast to the White Lotus guests who, in their pursuit of authentic experiences and self-discovery, repeatedly violate the basic principles of sincere interaction with both staff and each other. The shift from the regime of sincerity to one of authenticity exemplified by the White Lotus characters is just one transition among many that have led us, as a culture, to actively participate in neoliberal capitalism even while it daily asks us to violate many taboos of earlier times. Someone from a pre-modern culture seeing how we behave today would be very scared for us, racking up sin after sin with no rituals to contain or purge the supernatural punishment to come. The haunted capitalism genre imagines our world from this kind of perspective. The exploratory power in shows such as The White Lotus, Succession, and The Curse resides in their surface-level realism coupled with a narrative that seems to accept the force of things like curses,
Maybe she put a curse on me.
ghosts, and divine punishment. Haunted hospitality. All 3 seasons of The White Lotus have explored a theme that is prevalent throughout contemporary media critical of capitalism, the idea that ancient pre-modern beliefs and moral systems are haunting capitalism. Our neoliberal economic system violates numerous moral taboos from earlier time periods, from beliefs about the evil eye that warn against ostentatiousness,
Bling, bling, bling. Bitches is mad.
to expectations of reciprocity that clash with rent-seeking, to warnings about the hubris of attempting to control nature that conflict with limitless resource extraction. Contemporary media has found rich dramatic potential in imagining these ancient prohibitions reasserting themselves against those who dare to transgress their wisdom. Just to give a few examples, this happens in Bong Joon-ho's film Parasite, in which traditional Korean beliefs about ghosts haunt modern class relations, in Nathan Fielder's The Curse, in which an indigenous curse punishes a couple's performative activism and clueless gentrification.
I curse you.
What did she say?
In Succession, where a powerful family is ultimately undone by the ghosts of their drowned victims who resurface to demand justice, and in Severance, where corporate compartmentalization creates doppelgangers who become like Frankenstein's monsters, fractured consciousnesses that rebel against their creators and the system that birthed them. Each season of The White Lotus begins with the ritual arrival at the resort, stepping off the boat and onto the dock, receiving gifts of leis or champagne. With the completion of this exchange, the guests have crossed the threshold from their world to the world of the other. Threshold crossing is a central taboo from the ancient world. The threshold itself was considered a sacred space. In ancient Greece, Zeus was considered the god of strangers, and it was assumed that any stranger coming to one's house in search of hospitality could be a god in disguise, an idea later repeated in Judaism and Christianity with the story of Abraham, Sarah, and the 3 strangers, as well as the parable of the Good Samaritan. Do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by so doing, some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it. Hebrews 13:2. But threshold sacredness wasn't limited to Greek or Christian traditions. It was particularly significant in the very cultures depicted in The White Lotus. In Native American culture, thresholds were governed by kapu, or taboo systems that required specific protocols when entering sacred spaces, with severe consequences for violations. The Hawaiian concept of kai, to lead or guide, involves specific rituals for visitors crossing into new territories. In traditional Sicilian culture, the threshold, or solia, was protected by placing salt, iron objects, or religious symbols at entrances to ward off the malokyo, or evil eye, while in Thailand, spirit houses are still placed at thresholds of properties to appease spirits and ensure safe passage between worlds. Throughout history, crossing a threshold was a moment where social relationships could be totally redefined. For my etymology nerds, the words guest and host both come from the Proto-Indo-European word gosti, which means to level, revealing the connection between hospitality and the potential for mutual exchange. Today's thresholds, now purely functional, have lost their spiritual significance. Mediated through hotel key cards, automated doors, or digital check-ins, even in private homes, the threshold has lost its sacred character. We don't pause there or mark the transition, we simply pass through. Stripped of these ritualistic protections, threshold crossing has lost its power to equalize people. It's no surprise then that the threshold crossing in White Lotus is quite emphatically not a site of leveling. This loss is exemplified in Armand's instructions to the new employee about how staff must be as depersonalized as possible, creating a blank slate for the personalities and desires of the guests.
Self-disclosure is discouraged, especially with these VIPs who arrive on the boat. You know, you don't want to be too specific as a presence, as an identity. You want to be more generic.
Generic.
Yes. You know, it's a Japanese ethos where we are asked to disappear behind our masks as pleasant, interchangeable helpers. It's tropical kabuki.
This suspension of the resort guests' normal codes and social contracts creates what anthropologist Victor Turner would call a liminal space, a threshold zone where normal social structures are temporarily dissolved. They were marked by 3 stages according to Turner: segregation, margin or limin, and reaggregation. In the segregation phase, individuals are symbolically separated from their normal social position. The margin or liminal phase represents the threshold state where they exist between social categories, often undergoing a shared experience outside normal hierarchies. Finally, reaggregation involves a return to society with a new status or understanding. The White Lotus resorts effectively create the first 2 stages. Guests are segregated from their normal lives and enter the liminal space of the resort where normal rules seem suspended, but fail to provide the crucial 3rd stage. In traditional hospitality systems across cultures, guests were obligated to honor local customs and their significance, not as performance, but as recognition of entering a different cultural space. In Season 1, the Mossbacher family's casual treatment of Hawaiian cultural practices reveals a profound disrespect for the host culture. Mark and Nicole both treat the leis they receive in the welcome ceremony as disposable and visibly toss them aside, rather than recognizing that in Hawaiian culture, the giving of a lei carries significant meaning. Proper protocol involves accepting the lei with gratitude by bowing one's head, never removing it in the presence of the giver, which is considered disrespectful, and when it's time to remove it, not throwing it away carelessly, but rather returning it to the earth by hanging it on a tree or burying it.
The lei is an invitation or it's a promise. And by invitation, I mean if you were to come to the islands for the first time and I gave you or presented you with a lei, I would give you the lei and embrace you and watch your countenance. Because without words, I would be saying, would you allow me to spend time with you and share my Hawaii with you? And the second lei is the promise lei. And that lei basically says, I'm so pleased to have made you my heart friend, and I give you this lei so that you will remember and, when necessary, call upon the memories we've made.
Just like arrival, traditional rituals and taboos surrounding departure carried great significance in pre-modern communities. For example, in traditional Japanese culture, there's a custom called niokuri, literally seeing someone off. It involves watching the departing person until they're completely out of sight, which was believed to ensure their safe journey. Similarly, Benjamin Franklin famously noted that guests, like fish, began to smell after 3 days. These traditions recognize that hospitality exists within temporal boundaries. To ignore these limits was to transform from guest to parasite.
What does it matter what we think? If we think the right things or the wrong things, we all do the same shit. We're all still parasites on the earth.
The White Lotus guests represent a form of perpetual tourism that disrupts natural cycles of exchange, as we end each season with the workers waving to a new crop of wealthy tourists to replace those that just left. Where traditional hospitality contained itself within sacred temporal boundaries, modern tourism extends indefinitely, transforming places into perpetual hosting grounds with no reprieve. In Byung-Chul Han's essay, The Disappearance of Rituals, he talks about the ancient Greek system called xenia between guest friends. Xenia was the sacred code of hospitality that governed interactions between hosts and guests in ancient Greece, creating ritual bonds of mutual obligation and protection.
Who are you?
We're lost.
And eating my food!
And why not? No. It's true. We just helped ourselves. As your guests, we know. We bring gifts. That is the custom in this part of the world, no? That is the law.
One aspect of this relationship was that they would break a clay tablet in half when someone left, each keeping a piece that could be passed down through generations. This was called a symbolon. When descendants met up later, they could prove their connection by matching the broken pieces together like an ancient friendship necklace. Instead of departure rituals that would further cement guest-host relationships, we end each season of the White Lotus in a modern and alienated liminal space, the airport waiting area. In 2019, there was a trend in internet aesthetics called the backrooms or liminal spaces, which exploded on 4chan and Reddit. r/liminal space is in the top 1% of all subreddits by size. A24 is making a film set in the backrooms, and the creator of Severance have stated that the backrooms heavily influence the show's imagery of never-ending corridors and offices. One of the most popular types of image in this aesthetic, which millions of people were surprised to find weirdly compelling, is the genre of empty airports at 3 a.m. A lot of cultural critics have analyzed why so many people were intrigued by these images, including ContraPoints. Part of the explanation that people have given is that these spaces affect us in a similar eerie way that robots or other humanoids in the uncanny valley affect us. We get a chill when we look at images like this, partially because of the simulacra of humanity devoid of actual life. This characteristic is also present in these liminal spaces, which always lack any human or animal life. They look like a place, but they lack any warmth or vitality. Some empty places would not look liminal to us, like Bilbo Baggins' hobbit hole. The difference seems to be in the place's relationship to living things. The quality of coziness in an image comes from its lived-in appearance, whereas the back rooms and airport waiting areas look like places that people pass through without lingering. Pausing to reflect on these images through photography or being trapped in them in a way that does not transition, like the endless hallways of the back rooms or Severance, makes us feel the tension that builds up when we stop at margin or limen in Turner's 3 stages of liminality without the release that comes from rituals to guide us back to reintegration. The idea that human consciousness naturally seeks integration is a fascinating concept found across various disciplines. When consciousness is fragmented or compartmentalized, there seems to be an inherent drive towards wholeness. Neurologically, the brain constantly works to create a coherent narrative from disparate sensory inputs and memories. Our default mode network actively connects seemingly unrelated experiences into a unified sense of self. When we sleep, the brain works to integrate the day's experiences, sorting and connecting memories. Cognitive dissonance is experienced by the brain as similar to physical pain. This connects to ideas like Jung's individuation process, the integration of conscious and unconscious elements of the psyche towards a more complete self. As people have been calling out on social media, this theme of reintegrating different parts of ourselves in order to be ready to fight against oppressive systems is extremely prevalent in current media, reappearing in Severance, The Substance, and Mickey 17, as well as in previous precursor media that made similar points such as Fight Club and Black Swan. This doubling motif represents another crucial aspect of the haunted capitalism genre, the externalization of our psychological fragmentation into literal doppelgangers. In these narratives, capitalism is portrayed as requiring us to split ourselves, to compartmentalize and deny aspects of our humanity that don't serve productivity or consumption. The resulting shadow selves become monstrous precisely because they embody what the system demands we repress. The dramatic resolution in these stories frequently suggests that reintegration, the acceptance of one's complete self including denied or monstrous parts, is the first step towards liberation.
But I'm her, Mark. I'm her.
This aligns with psychoanalytic perspectives that view projection of unacceptable parts of ourselves onto others as the individual-level version of fascism. By confronting and accepting our shadow selves, these narratives suggest we might begin to resist the system that demands our fragmentation in the first place. In The White Lotus, we see a variation of this theme when Frank attempts to reconcile with aspects of himself through having sex with men who resemble him physically.
So I put out an ad looking for a white guy, my age, come over and fuck me. Found a guy looked a lot like me. Then I put on some lingerie and perfume, made myself look like one of these girls. And I thought I looked pretty hot. And then this guy came over and railed the shit out of him.
This moment of potential self-acceptance through external mirrors offers a glimpse of the integration these other narratives position as necessary for any meaningful resistance. But Mike White, of course, complicates this by also suggesting that this internal work on the part of the privileged often demands an othered witness.
And at the same time, I'd hire an Asian girl to just sit there and watch the whole thing. I'd look in her eyes while some guy was fucking me, and I'd think, I am her, and I'm fucking me.
This speech left me grappling with a question that a lot of the doppelganger media also left me with. Is integration of the self the first step, or is solidarity with others the first step? Is it more important for Mark S. to reintegrate Innie and Audi, or to join forces with his fellow MDR crew and love even the monstrous part of Helly as the first step towards accepting all of himself, including his trauma? Is it more important for Sam Rockwell to accept the potentially queer or gender-bending desires he has within himself, or to have solidarity with the young Asian girl he's paying to watch all this go down? Frank's story offers both hope and critique. On the one hand, his turn to Buddhism suggests a possible path beyond capitalism's cycles of consumption. On the other hand, his journey required extreme privilege and exploitation of others, raising the question of whether individual awakening is a viable path to systemic change and where it belongs in the order of operations of liberation. These tensions between individual integration and collective solidarity point to deeper questions about the nature of selfhood that Eastern philosophies have long contemplated. While Western psychological frameworks often presuppose a coherent self that must be healed or reconciled, Eastern traditions take a fundamentally different approach. Eastern philosophical traditions, like those explored in the season of the White Lotus, with its repeated references to the idea that identity is an illusion or prison.
Identity is a prison. No one is spared this prison.
Meditation can bring relief to psychic pain. Meditation helps you see that the identity you've created brings you suffering.
Similarly emphasize the dissolution of false divisions within consciousness. In Thai Buddhism, the concept of anatta, or non-self, points to the reality that what we experience as fragmentation comes from our attachment to a false sense of self. Further, mindfulness and meditation practices like those Amrita is trying to share with the guests aim at being present with all aspects of reality instead of compartmentalizing them. As this season concludes with the guests waiting at the airport's sterile liminal space, we see them without any ritual to help integrate their experiences at the White Lotus. This leaves viewers with the sense that despite all they have been through, most characters will fail to truly change, either personally or as part of larger systems. Although we leave most of the characters stuck in liminality, implying that they're in a closed loop and will repeat the same patterns, the last thing we see in each season is actually one person who has been able to escape the loop. Quinn in Season 1, sailing off, reconnected with nature, and Lucia in Season 2, having successfully completed her Robin Hood gambit. Each death in the White Lotus can be understood as a moment where suppressed, pre-modern moral systems erupt through the superficial veneer of market relations. In Season 1, Armand's death functions as a sacrificial ritual that provides this resolution, not unlike the scapegoats and ritual sacrifices that maintain social balance in pre-modern societies. For example, in ancient Greece, the pharmakos ritual involved selecting marginalized person who would absorb the community's sins and impurities before being expelled or sacrificed during times of crisis, purifying the community through their removal. Similarly, in Hebrew tradition, the original scapegoat was a goat symbolically loaded with the sins of the community and driven into the wilderness on Yom Kippur. Armand's death, while appearing to be the result of individual conflicts between him and Shane, actually serves to restore the social order by absorbing and containing the contradictions inherent in the resort's commodified version of hospitality. Armand becomes the vessel through which this imbalance is purged, allowing the guests to return home cleansed. Season 2 presents another manifestation of what Freud might describe as the return of the repressed, in the form of the Testo de Moro legend. This legend, hinted at in the repeated cameos of ceramic heads throughout the season, serves as an unheeded warning about the dangers of relationships between the powerful and the powerless. These ceramic heads commemorate the legendary tale of a Sicilian woman who beheaded her Muslim lover for betraying her trust, a story that emerged during a period when Sicily was under Muslim rule. The legend depicts a native Sicilian woman from the politically subordinate group exacting brutal revenge against a man from the ruling class, symbolizing how intimate relationships across power differentials can become sites of violent resistance. The Testa de Moro thus served as a warning to the powerful that their dominance was never absolute and that vulnerability in intimate relationships could lead to their downfall. In pursuing romantic and sexual connections that cross boundaries of power, wealth, and cultural understanding, characters like Tanya, Portia, and Albie ignore the critical warnings written into the decor of their surroundings. In psychoanalytic terms, what is most forcibly repressed often returns with the greatest intensity. The White Lotus resorts function as spaces that deliberately attempt to repress history, power dynamics, and moral consequences.
Something bad could have happened. Something bad did happen.
For example, the fact that the first season's resort is located on land stolen from Kai's native Hawaiian family is a fact that is repressed and obscured by having him perform traditional Hawaiian dances in that same place. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does the psyche. When the resort tries to create consequence-free zones by suppressing local histories, traditional moral codes, and genuine cultural exchange, it paradoxically creates the perfect conditions for these repressed elements to erupt with violent force. Colonialism and bad guests. Unlike ancient traditions like Xenia, in which hosts could expect to one day be guests and vice versa, guests in the White Lotus will never host the locals and workers who they leave behind. In fact, many post-colonial theorists have criticized the way that pre-modern concepts of hospitality, such as the aloha spirit, have been imposed in a one-way relationship, perverting the original purpose of hospitality. Thai culture offers sabai-sabai, superficially translated as taking it easy, but actually embodying profound cultural values of emotional equilibrium and deliberate slowness, which, like aloha, has been commodified and hollowed out for tourist consumption. The concept has been heavily marketed towards Westerners, for example in this package tour, The Spirit of Sabai-Sabai, which literally asks, why spend the time and money to go somewhere if you can't take those philosophical ideas, like sabai-sabai, home with you alongside a few souvenirs? Directly linking the Thai way of life to a physical commodity. As Jamaica Kincaid has written in A Small Place, that the native does not like the tourist is not hard to explain. For every native of every place is a potential tourist, and every tourist is a native of somewhere. Every native everywhere lives a life of overwhelming and crushing banality, and boredom, and desperation, and depression, and every deed, good and bad, is an attempt to forget this. Every native would like to find a way out. Every native would like a rest. Every native would like a tour. But some natives, most natives in the world, cannot go anywhere. They are too poor. They are too poor to go anywhere. They are too poor to escape the reality of their lives, and they are too poor to live properly in the place they live, which is the very place you, the tourist, want to go. So when the natives see you, the tourist, they envy you. They envy your ability to leave your own banality and boredom. They envy your ability to turn their own banality and boredom into a source of pleasure for yourself.
It's like we're being pushed out of Hawaii, and as a native Hawaiian, I'm very sad for our people. Every day, I think about that.
Oaxaca no es mercancía.
So this huge flow we're getting every day, it's just unbearable.
Every single day you find a problem, you know, when you had to cross the street, when you had to buy something, when you had to get the public boat.
I started crying. Because I said, I can't believe this, that we gotta move from here. And it still hurts. It still hurts. But there's nothing we can do. It really hurts.
We don't have enough flats for inhabitants. So people's moving away because you cannot find a place to live here.
Losing people, losing inhabitants means losing the character of the city. You know, now it's becoming Disneyland.
This asymmetry of mobility is further institutionalized through visa regimes that systematically favor travelers from wealthy nations. While US and European passport holders can visit most countries worldwide with minimal restrictions, citizens from Thailand, Haiti, Jamaica, and other tourism-dependent economies face extensive barriers, including costly application fees, income requirements, and extensive documentation demands. This creates a system where hospitality flows in only one direction. The economically privileged global north traveler freely experiences the global south, while the reverse journey remains largely impossible. Kincaid critiques tourism as an extension of colonialism, a modern performance of extraction where the privileged consume the beauty of other places while remaining insulated from the suffering that made that beauty possible. The White Lotus echoes this critique, but it also adds another layer by turning its gaze inwards toward whiteness itself. In this way, the show mirrors the approach of critical race theorists like Bell Hooks, who argue for deneutralizing whiteness, treating it as a subject worthy of scrutiny rather than an invisible norm. The White Lotus explores the particular form of malaise that Hooks identifies, the numbness of capitalist modernity, but intensified for those inheriting wealth built on extraction.
Many young people come here from your country. I think because maybe spiritual malaise.
These characters are not just restless because of general modern alienation, but because they are psychologically and morally unmoored by benefiting from a system that they also find spiritually corrosive. This is why the characters' attempts to find meaning, to escape through spiritual tourism, sexual adventure, or reckless consumption feel both urgent and hollow. Some, like Piper or Frank, are self-aware enough to recognize their alienation, but that self-awareness doesn't necessarily liberate them from the harm they reproduce. The show suggests that self-awareness on its own is insufficient. Knowing you're complicit does not automatically offer a path out of complicity. It may only deepen the discomfort of living within these contradictions. And yet, White's approach is not without compassion. While his satire is sharp, it isn't nihilistic. The psychic cost of benefiting from exploitation is not as visible or serious as the suffering it produces, but it is still there.
So unfair, and
I'm so tired.
Oh, boo-hoo! Let me play a sad song for you on the world's smallest violin.
In this way, the White Lotus critiques whiteness not just for what it has historically taken, but for what it has lost. The loss of connection, of rootedness, of moral clarity. This is the same malaise that Hooks identified in Eating the Other, as the impetus behind trends like cultural appropriation, the need to spice up whiteness. But there's another layer to why these characters seek escape, one that feels psychoanalytic in its intensity. Travel for many is an attempt to run, not just from boredom or dissatisfaction, but from death itself. The writer Vincent Cunningham has argued that both travel and literature offer ways to thicken life, to stretch it, to live multiple lives instead of just one.
And really the only other thing that I can think of like that is literature. This thing that's supposed to like sort of double your life, you know, make your life more than what it can really plausibly actually be, given all of the limits of our lives. Here's a way to make it seem denser, thicker than it was.
In this view, the desire to travel is in part a desire to cheat death, to gather experiences that stave off the creeping sense of finitude. Every season opens with a body, death looming as an inevitable endpoint. The guests are not just running from their mundane lives, but from their own mortality. And the show insists that while they can consume beauty, pleasure, even other cultures, they can't consume their way out of mortality. Through the technique of examining whiteness more carefully, White complicates the notion that tourism is reciprocal. It isn't just about money exchanged for experience. When you pay $10,000 a night for your room at a place like the White Lotus, where does that money actually go? The modern tourism industry has perfected what economists call economic leakage, transforming the wealth of formerly colonized nations into Western shareholders' dividends. Economic leakage statistics show that 70% of tourism dollars leave Thailand, 80% in the Caribbean, and 85% of African safari companies are owned by white people. The luxury resort is less a part of the local economy and more a financial pipeline to the West. To summarize this way too briefly, following a massive wave of decolonization in the 1960s, many formerly colonized countries advocated strongly for something called the New International Economic Order, or NIEO. The NIEO was a set of UN proposals to restructure the global economy in order to attempt to reverse some of the harms of the colonial period, including policies such as fair commodity pricing, technology transfer, debt relief, corporate regulation, and increased global South representation in financial institutions. Many of the countries that advocated the most strongly for the NIEO are currently top tourist destinations for the citizens of former imperial states. The countries that advocated for the NIEO argued that political independence wasn't enough. True decolonization required economic sovereignty and restructuring of global economic relations. In many ways, tourism illustrates exactly what they were worried about: formal political independence coexisting with continued economic dependence via foreign control of key sectors of their economies. The United States, home country of most of our White Lotus guests, has vehemently opposed the NIEO, as did the other Western powers. Thailand is one of the group of 77 developing nations who have consistently voted for the proposal when it is raised at the UN. However, despite its formal adoption in 1974, Western nations effectively prevented the NIEO's implementation through their control of international financial institutions. Instead of the NIEO's vision, we got a regime where legal and financial mechanisms, such as sovereign debt and structural adjustment, allowed rich countries to use the very wealth that they accumulated through colonialism to purchase formerly colonized countries' assets, including much of their tourism industries. Many countries that had supported the NIEO were effectively forced to liberalize their tourism sectors and accept foreign investment as conditions of IMF World Bank loans in the 1980s and 1990s. Scholars in the field of third world approaches to international law, or TWAIL, have provided extensive critiques of the international investment law regime, particularly bilateral investment treaties, or BITs, and investor-state dispute settlement, or ISDS. The dispute resolution process itself reflects colonial power structures. When there's an alleged violation of one of these treaties, the case is typically sent to arbitration in a Western capital like London or Paris, presided over by Western-trained arbitrators, and decided based on legal principles developed in Western legal traditions. In terms of tourism specifically, these legal mechanisms can prevent countries from implementing policies that might help address economic leakage. For example, if Thailand attempted to require foreign-owned hotels like the fictional White Lotus to source a percentage of their supplies from local businesses, or to hire a minimum percentage of local management, or partner with local tour operators, they could face investor-state arbitration for violating fair and equitable treatment standards in their investment treaties. The mere threat of such expensive arbitration often creates a chilling effect, deterring countries from implementing regulations that could help their local economies benefit more from tourism. This constrained sovereignty makes these nations particularly vulnerable to what critics have compared to another colonial economic legacy, monoculture crop dependence. Just as colonial powers once pushed countries to focus on a single export crop, many nations today find themselves overly reliant on tourism. Both systems create dangerous dependencies. A monoculture crop leaves farmers vulnerable to price fluctuations and crop failures, while tourism-dependent economies become hostage to seasonal fluctuations, global economic downturns, and changing travel trends. We see this vulnerability played out dramatically in how COVID-19 devastated tourism-dependent economies, just as monoculture banana plantations were historically devastated by Panama disease. The pineapple's journey from indigenous staple to colonial status symbol perfectly illustrates this extractive relationship. Originally cultivated by Tupi-Guarani peoples in present-day Brazil and Paraguay, the pineapple was transformed through colonial trade networks into one of history's most potent symbols of hospitality and wealth. Colonial elites paid the equivalent of thousands of modern dollars for a single pineapple, with some even renting pineapples just to display at parties before returning them to be sold for consumption. White Lotus Season 1 cleverly references this through the pineapple suite dispute, guests fighting over a room named after hospitality's symbol while displaying profoundly inhospitable behavior.
Yep, okay.
This irony extends to Hawaii itself, where pineapple plantations became the archetype of monocrop dependence, with Dole and other Western corporations controlling vast tracts of indigenous land. The fruit that indigenous peoples called excellent fruit became, like the islands themselves, something to be consumed by wealthy visitors with little benefit flowing back to native populations. But even the criticism that the NIEO leveled can tend to lull us into thinking that there was a period of colonization in which these assets were taken by physical violence, but we're now in a neocolonial period in which the violence that is being done to Global South peoples is economic and psychic, resulting in poverty and dependence rather than death and displacement. Unfortunately, the colonial fantasy and its attendant physical violence lives on. In February 2025, President Trump posted an AI-generated video reimagining Gaza as Trump Gaza.
Donald is coming to set you free, bringing the light for all to see. No more tunnels, no more fear. Trump Gaza is finally here. Trump Gaza shining bright, golden future, a brand new light. Feast and dance, the deal is done. Trump Gaza, number one. Trump Gaza shining bright, golden future, a brand new light. Feast and dance, the deal is done. Trump Gaza, number one.
We have an opportunity to do something that could be phenomenal. And I don't want to be cute, I don't want to be a wise guy, but the Riviera of the Middle East, this could be something that could be so bad, this could be so magnificent.
A luxury resort with palm trees, high-rises, and even a golden Trump statue. The video depicted Trump and Netanyahu sunbathing, while Gazans ostensibly celebrated their new resort lifestyle. This real-world example perfectly illustrates how the colonial imagination continues to view other people's land and suffering as potential sites for profitable Western leisure.
What did I steal?
Well, I guess it's not stealing when you think everything's already yours.
These tensions between tourism development and local communities aren't just theoretical concerns in The White Lotus, but extend beyond the narrative itself into the very production of the show. Season 3 was filmed at 2 luxury properties in Thailand, the Four Seasons Koh Samui and the Anantara Mi Khao in Phuket. The ownership structures of these resorts perfectly illustrate the economic leakage and neocolonial patterns we've been discussing here. The Four Seasons Koh Samui is owned by Four Seasons Hotels and Resorts, a Toronto-based multinational corporation, exemplifying how profits from Thai tourism frequently flow to Western shareholders rather than local communities. Meanwhile, the Anantara property, while operated by Minor International, which is technically a Thai-based company, reveals another layer of complexity. Minor was founded and is controlled by William Heinecke, an American businessman and billionaire who relocated to Thailand. This real-world parallel eerily mirrors the fictional character of Jim Hollinger, the American owner of the White Lotus Thailand, who allegedly killed Rick's father in a land dispute with locals. The real-world Anantara Mai Khao sits on land that was once a natural monkey habitat, while the Four Seasons was developed on previously undeveloped coastline. The irony extends further when we consider that viewers watching a critique of luxury tourism are simultaneously consuming visual tourism porn, lingering shots of pristine beaches and opulent accommodations that serve as advertisement for these properties, which have already caused an increase in Western tourism to these exact properties, the White Lotus effect. This season, HBO and its parent company have aggressively commodified the White Lotus experience, partnering with brands from Banana Republic and Supergoop to Abercrombie & Fitch and Coffee Mate. You can now buy a White Lotus cocktail, sleep mask, or even a branded chocolate bar, allowing consumers to literally purchase fragments of the show's aesthetic. These products package the luxury of the show into purchasable experiences while hollowing out the original critique. It's a textbook example of capitalism's ability to absorb and neutralize its own criticism, turning even a satire of conspicuous consumption into another branded opportunity for conspicuous consumption. Even countercultural or critical art is commodified, ensuring that discomfort is neutralized through consumption. You can mock the capitalist tourist class while selling them a luxury vacation and a $1,000 hoodie. This inescapability of systemic complicity emerges in another key storyline of Season 3, Timothy Ratliff's storyline, facing investigation for what appears to be foreign bribery or securities fraud. Critical legal theorists have long observed what Bernard Harcourt terms the selective criminalization thesis, the process by which certain harmful behaviors become defined as criminal, while others of equal or greater social harm remain merely regulatory matters. This creates a two-tiered system of justice, a punitive regime for the poor and a rehabilitative, forgiving system for the wealthy. While Timothy worries about prosecution, the comparative leniency of white-collar sentencing, particularly for first-time offenders of his socioeconomic status, stands in stark contrast to how theft by the poor is punished. The average sentence for bank robbery in the United States is around 7 to 10 years, while securities fraud, which often involves vastly larger sums, typically results in 3 to 5 years, frequently in minimum security facilities, sometimes derisively called Club Fed. The fact that characters like Timothy, Rick's friend Frank, and Greg Gary are able to flee legal consequences in another country is what scholars call jurisdictional arbitrage. Perhaps most significantly, Timothy's potential prosecution represents what critical theorist Douglas Hay called the theater of criminal justice. Occasional high-profile prosecutions of elites that maintain the illusion of equal justice while preserving class hierarchies. These prosecutions serve an ideological function by demonstrating that no one is above the law, while ensuring that the structures enabling widespread harm remain intact. This theater parallels the ceremonial compliance Twale scholars identify in international law, where powerful nations occasionally accept adverse rulings or treaty obligations to maintain the system's legitimacy while ensuring their fundamental interests remain protected. In both domestic white-collar crime and international economic law, occasional concessions mask systemic advantage. What Timothy's storyline ultimately reveals is how transgression is built into the very structure of capitalism rather than representing a deviation from it. As criminologist William Chambliss observed, the line between criminal and legitimate business practice often comes down to matters of degree rather than kind. The same aggressive pursuit of profit that earns celebration when successful becomes criminal only when it crosses often arbitrary and shifting lines. Crimes Timothy likely engaged in resemble the legitimate activities of investing, deal-making, and relationship management that form the backbone of global business. His crime isn't a departure from the capitalist logic, but its extension into officially prohibited territory. And honestly, the consequences that the show threatens likely would never happen IRL.
Guys, worst case scenario, let's say every single dollar this man has ever made has been illegal. It's all dirty money. He's married with dependents. So it's so hard to be able to take everything from him because it's not all his. They can't leave his dependents destitute. That's not how it works.
Timothy's legal transgressions represent a modern form of theft protected by complex legal structures and differential enforcement, but they're merely one manifestation of a broader pattern of transgression that characterizes the White Lotus guest relationships to their host countries and cultures. Beyond the fact that the relationship between the guests and hosts in White Lotus is not reciprocal, as we have highlighted here in our discussion of the continuing neo-colonial relations between them and their hosts, the guests could also be seen as bad guests by pre-modern standards.
Garbage. This garbage.
Okay, I'm taking the garbage out.
Yes, no, you don't take the garbage out just like that. You should have kept the room clean. My logic is that if this was left in my room, I don't know if the sheets are clean, I don't know if the towels were clean, or they just look spotless and they were not cleaned.
Like the suitors in the Odyssey, they consume without limit or intention of repayment, treat servants as objects for their pleasure and entertainment, and attempt to remake the space of hospitality in their own image. The White Lotus makes pretty explicit references to the Odyssey in its choice of title, which refers to the Lotus Eaters, who forget about the rest of the world in their hedonism. Armand specifically calls the guests Lotus Eaters, expressing his disgust at watching them eat.
Sometimes just watching them eat every night makes me want to gouge my eyes out. The Lotus Eaters. Hateful as the dark blue sky, vaulted o'er the dark blue sea. Death is the end of life. Ah, why should life all labor be?
Speaking of gross eating, remember that nasty scene in Lord of the Rings where Lord Denethor is just demolishing all those cherry tomatoes while his son is literally dying? He's depicted this way because he is overstaying his welcome as the steward of Gondor, sitting on the throne, which is rightfully Aragorn's, just like the suitors in the Odyssey. I'm so annoyed I'm making this video before the Nolan Odyssey movie comes out. Can you guys imagine how beautiful my clips would have been? Oh. The scene in which Armand compares the guests to self-involved lotus eaters and expresses disgust at watching them eat reflects the show's thesis that the White Lotus guests, like the suitors or Lord Denethor, are usurpers of unearned hospitality. He recites lines from Tennyson's The Lotus Eaters, specifically from section 4 of the poem where it asks, "Death is the end of life. Ah, why should life all labor be?" This serves as both commentary on the guest's privilege and a foreshadowing of his own fate. Beyond their general resemblance to Homeric bad guests, the White Lotus visitors violate specific sacred principles of traditional hospitality that transcended cultural boundaries. One of the most sacred aspects of ancient hospitality customs was the truthful exchange of identities and narratives. In Greek Xenia, guests were expected to share honest accounts of themselves and their journeys. The White Lotus subverts this tradition by populating its resort with guests who systematically conceal, misdirect, and fabricate. Harper, in season 2, hides her true feelings about her marriage from everyone, including herself.
You're not a good liar.
Because I'm not lying and I don't lie.
Shane, in season 1, constructs an elaborate performance of honeymoon bliss that masks his controlling nature, as symbolized by his actor's name appearing next to a chameleon in the title sequence. Tanya, across seasons, presents a version of herself designed to elicit sympathy while concealing her manipulative tendencies. These deceptions violate what anthropologist Marcel Mauss identified as the essential reciprocal exchange at the heart of gift economies, the gift of truth. The violation of Xenia is a major theme in several ancient Greek myths, with perhaps the most famous example being the Trojan War itself. Paris violated the sacred laws of hospitality when, as a guest in Menelaus' home, he abducted Helen. This breach of Xenia was seen not just as a personal affront, but a violation of divine law. In Aeschylus's Orestia, Clytemnestra's murder of Agamemnon is made even more horrific because she kills him just after welcoming him home, violating both familial bonds and the sacred laws of hospitality in one stabby moment. The story of Procne and Philomela involves a horrific violation of guest right when Tereus, after being hosted by Pandion, rapes and mutilates Pandion's daughter Philomela. This leads to a cycle of revenge involving cannibalism, Procne feeding Tereus his own son, showing how violations of hospitality lead to the breakdown of all social bonds. And perhaps most tellingly for this season, the events in Oedipus Rex, including all the incest, can be seen to flow from the violation of hospitality by Laius, Oedipus's father, who kidnapped and raped the son of a family that hosted him, leading to a curse being placed on all of Thebes and eventually leading Oedipus to sleep with his own mother.
Yeah, you agree? Yeah, I do. I do, actually.
The fact that these violations often lead to cannibalism and incest in these stories suggests that breaking the laws of hospitality was seen as a fundamental violation of what makes us human, a descent into bestiality. That is part of the explanation for why incest is a consistent theme this season between the brothers and through Gary's desire for his mother. Because like these canonical pieces of ancient literature, Mike White is also communicating that certain norm violations veer into the territory of total breakdown of the social and moral order. Game of Thrones explores these same themes through the Red Wedding. A wedding feast is meant to be a ritual liminal space, but here it instead becomes perverted into a scene of extreme violence. The horror of this event stems not just from the murders themselves, but from their context. The Starks were killed after participating in the sacred ritual of bread and salt, a formal invocation of guest right. George R.R. Martin drew inspiration from actual Northern European customs similar to Xenia's, such as griot in Norse culture and Cuares Comain in Celtic culture. The Red Wedding itself was based on two historical Scottish events, the Black Dinner of 1440 and the Glencoe Massacre in 1692. Both considered especially heinous because they violated Highland Scottish codes of hospitality. Returning to Byung-Chul Han's analysis in The Disappearance of Ritual, he argues that the violence of ancient hospitality violations was terrible but meaningful. It reaffirmed the importance of boundaries being broken. Modern violations don't reaffirm anything. When a modern hotel overbooks or an Airbnb host cancels last minute, we see it as a contract violation or an inconvenience, not a tear in the fabric of civilization itself. The stakes feel lower because we've lost what Han calls the religious grammar that gave these acts their deeper meaning. My interpretation of why hospitality was of such importance was that it provided a kind of irreducible social minimum. Even if you fell on hard luck, you could avail yourself of others' hospitality. And the fact that this was the case was what distinguished us from beasts. In contrast, today we do accept things like widespread homelessness. Pre-modern understandings of hospitality also reflected a sophisticated recognition of the inherent dangers in welcoming strangers. As described in the work of anthropologist Franz Boas, the Inuit welcome a newcomer to their village with a huge feast, but also a ritual in which his strength is tested by an exchange of blows. The official rule of this encounter was that if he proved inferior, he would be executed, but this almost never happened. It was a threat that actually allowed for the peaceful integration of the new person into the village. All of these pre-modern systems around the world that we've been discussing, from the Inuit ritual combat to the Greek xenia, were not just cute customs about being nice to guests. They were complex mechanisms for managing and containing the ambiguity of the host-guest relationship between welcome and threat, intimacy and danger. We discussed earlier that ghosty gives us both guest and host, but it also gives us hostile, suggesting that these concepts were never truly separate. The characters on White Lotus spend remarkably little time engaging with local cultures or people, instead remaining within the carefully curated confines of the resort. This behavior might seem paradoxical. Why travel thousands of miles only to experience a sanitized version of the destination? Unless we understand travel primarily as a form of cultural capital rather than cultural exchange. As Sean P. Smith argues in Landscapes for Likes, self-produced images of travelers against exotic backdrops have become crucial markers of social class belonging in contemporary society. The cultural practice of waiting in long queues to capture the perfect mountaintop selfie parallels the Romantic painting tradition, particularly works like Caspar David Friedrich's Wanderer Above the Sea Fog. Smith specifically identifies a compositional technique he calls the promontory witness in these images, where the subject is positioned above an empty landscape in a way that centers their viewpoint and suggests surveillance and ownership. This style, exemplified in Friedrich's Wanderer Above the Sea Fog, differs significantly from other sublime paintings that depict humans as small and humbled before awesome natural forces. Instead, the promontory witness composition places the human figure in a position of mastery and dominance over the landscape. This visual strategy has direct colonial implications as it recreates the surveying gaze of the colonizer assessing territory for conquest or exploitation. The tourist photographs that mimic this composition unconsciously reproduce this power dynamic, positioning the visitor as the central subject whose perspective organizes and gives meaning to the empty landscape. Interestingly, this same compositional technique appears in Severance's portraits of Keir Egan, where the corporate founder is similarly positioned as promontory witness surveying his domain, suggesting parallels between corporate and colonial forms of dominance and surveillance. Modern tourist photographs function similarly to the portraits English gentlemen commissioned of themselves with Italian ruins after completing the Grand Tour in the 18th and 19th centuries. as forms of what Veblen would call conspicuous leisure. Both visually announce that the subject possesses sufficient wealth to afford international travel, can escape the demands of labor for leisure, and has acquired culturally valued experiences abroad. The artifice of the tourist's engagement with local culture is vividly illustrated in Season 2 when Tanya seeks out a fortune teller's services in Sicily.
Authentic, old world, gypsy.
When the fortune teller offers a genuine reading that doesn't align with Tanya's expectations, warning of a potential betrayal rather than delivering the romantic affirmations she sought,
this card means deceit is being deceitful, and this card is beauty. There is someone beautiful in his life.
Couldn't that be me?
Not you.
Not me.
For sure not you.
Tanya immediately rejects the experience.
You are so negative.
Her dismissal of the fortune teller's vision demonstrates how tourists desire the appearance of cultural engagement without accepting its unpredictable outcomes. Authentic interaction means surrendering control over the narrative, something these privileged travelers find intolerable. Even more revealing is the De Grasso family's expedition to their ancestral Sicilian village. Armed with romanticized notions of their heritage, they arrive expecting a warm welcome and confirmation of their imagined connection to the place. Instead, they face open hostility from the local women. This jarring rejection shatters their carefully constructed narrative of homecoming and heritage. Their bewilderment reveals how tourism often functions not as cultural exchange, but as a fantasy projection that serves the visitor's psychological needs rather than engaging with complex realities. This explains why the White Lotus guests rarely venture beyond resort boundaries except for carefully controlled excursions. Actual engagement with locals outside the service context would require surrendering control and facing potential rejection or discomfort. The resort functions as a stage where guests can appear worldly while remaining insulated from genuine difference, paradoxically traveling thousands of miles to avoid the very encounters that genuine travel might provide. To summarize, the guests at the White Lotus, whether they intended or not, participate in a global economic system in which the native Hawaiian, Sicilian, or Thai people don't get much in return for sharing their land, culture, and hospitality. The guests gain cultural capital and get to choose how they interact with the host culture, picking aspects that serve them and tossing away those that don't.
Part 4: Monkeys and Water. Season 3 punctuates its narrative with telling transition scenes, either watchful monkey statues silently witnessing human folly, or relentless waves threatening to engulf the camera, dual symbols that frame the season's thematic core. Let's break down the related meanings of these two central motifs of this season. Monkey business. Monkeys are everywhere this season, from the mischievous creatures in the trees surrounding the resort to figurines representing the see no evil, speak no evil, hear no evil monkeys displayed in various settings, and this, to references to the Buddhist concept of the monkey mind. In fact, monkeys have featured prominently in all 3 seasons, with Armand having a see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil figurine on his desk, and the tapestries in the opening credits of all 3 seasons depicting monkeys. Monkey figures in world folklore often function as tricksters who temporarily upend social hierarchies, revealing their constructed rather than natural character. Monkeys represent a liminal figure between the human and animal worlds that often relates to our anxieties about our connection with nature. This season's monkey references connect to rich traditions in Thai mythology and folklore, particularly the stories of Hanuman from the Ramakien, Thailand's version of the Ramayana, and Buddhist origin stories called Jataka tales. In Thai Buddhist temples, Hanuman is depicted as a monkey that is able to rise up from the animal world to become a leader of men, upending hierarchy. The symbolism of Hanuman as a sort of Robin Hood figure was relied upon to structure another recent anti-capitalist revenge film, Dev Patel's Monkey Man. In Thai folklore, stories abound of clever monkeys who fool kings, mimic humans, or rise in social rank through cunning, echoing the trickster hero legacy of Hanuman. These stories show how easily social hierarchies can be penetrated by those who understand their superficial nature. This connects to a broader tradition of ritualized hierarchy reversals found across pre-modern cultures. Thailand's Songkran Festival, featured in this season, traditionally involved elements of such reversal, with younger people allowed to playfully splash water on elders and authority figures, a temporary suspension of normal deference that would be inappropriate during ordinary times. When the big blonde blob characters are offended by children soaking them with water, they are completely missing the point of the festival. Similarly, medieval Europe's Feast of Fools or ancient Rome's Saturnalia featured servants becoming masters for a day, with normal social rules temporarily inverted. These ritual inversions served a complex social function. They acknowledged the constructed nature of hierarchy while ultimately reinforcing it through controlled release. The temporary nature of these reversals, always followed by a return to normal order, contained potential resistance to social hierarchies while providing a pressure valve for tensions arising from inequality. As Mikhail Bakhtin observed in his analysis of Carnival, these inversions created a second world where critique was possible precisely because it was cordoned off from everyday reality. From a Marxist psychoanalytic perspective, these ritualized inversions reveal a fascinating contradiction. As Zizek might argue, they simultaneously undermined and supported the dominant order, challenging hierarchy through mockery while ultimately containing that challenge within acceptable boundaries. The festival acknowledged inequality's arbitrary nature while preventing that acknowledgement from threatening the system itself. Contemporary capitalism no longer feels compelled to provide even limited forms of ritual inversion, as brilliantly satirized in Triangle of Sadness in the jacuzzi scene.
Let's reverse role.
Sorry?
Just change roles. You chillax in the jacuzzi, and I get the cap.
Oh, come on.
Just be in the moment like I was, please.
Yeah,
come on.
Yeah.
I know you want to. Come
Yes,
on.
I do, but
So go in.
yeah, but there might be a problem for me if I...
Now I have to be the authority.
Yeah, well, I have my clothes on.
Shut up now. I command you, enjoy the moment.
Instead, capitalism exhorts us to enjoy and consume and naturalizes inequality as a result of market forces requiring no moral justification or ritual suspension. This scene really exemplifies Zizek's argument that in traditional authority, the command was obey, but in capitalist ideology, the command is sneakier, enjoy. We are told to enjoy work, do what you love, enjoy leisure, you deserve the spa day, enjoy resistance, buy the Che Guevara tote. Even enjoy your own marginalization, celebrate your trauma on TikTok. Despite the fact that the idea of hierarchy inversion has been hollowed out in our culture, it still retains meaning in Thai tradition, symbolized by the monkey. That makes the placement of monkey statues throughout the season yet another example of a pre-modern, pre-capitalist system haunting the story, not as nostalgia, but as a moral framework that continues to lurk beneath the surface, watching, waiting, and refusing to fully disappear. Water as revolutionary force. While monkey figures suggest temporary subversion of hierarchies, water imagery promises their complete dissolution. Water doesn't merely invert social orders temporarily, it threatens to permanently erode boundaries and wash away established structures entirely. In shows like The White Lotus, Succession, Severance, Industry, and movies like Parasite and Triangle of Sadness, we see how water functions as a symbol in critiques of capitalism. Water represents a lot of things: the womb or feminine, cleansing, purity and wholeness, chaos, the subconscious, and even death. But here I want to focus on water as a representation of change, and even revolutionary change. Klaus Tewelite's Male Fantasies analyzes the fascist fear of dissolution, particularly through water imagery. His work examines the writings of fascists in Nazi Germany, their literature, diaries, and letters, which portrayed fears of flooding, dissolution of boundaries, and uncontrollable fluidity as threats to order and hierarchy. According to Tewelite, in the fascist imagination, water, especially flooding, represents threats to social order, the breakdown of hierarchy, boundaries, and control. Fascists feared being swept away by the masses, often portrayed as a dangerous, feminine, fluid force. Today, we can hear this reflected in what I like to call the quadripartite schema of reactionary hydrophobicity. First, we have rhetoric about immigration and border security today, which is depicted as a flood, wave, or tide, or as Nick Fuentes, aka Mr. Fountains, calls it, a demographic tsunami, that should be dealt with by stemming the tide or fortifying the floodgates.
I don't know the exact idiom, the exact expression, but we're on this sinking ship, and our country is being flooded with illegal immigrants and illegal immigrants pouring across the border.
And whoever opened the spigot and flooded our country with 15 or 25 million illegals.
Yeah. No country
that has ever existed, that has ever lived, that has ever been on this earth, has allowed this number of foreign nationals to illegally enter its territory. We are living in uncharted waters.
Then we have a critique of the government bureaucracy that imagines it as moist and teeming in Drain the Swamp. Third, we have the anti-democratic strain that conceptualizes of the democratic polity as the churning open ocean. Curtis Yarvin, an influential figure in neo-reactionary thought admired by many techno-libertarians, describes democracy as the ocean, a chaotic, destabilizing force threatening the order and hierarchy of dry land. In his praise of Thomas Carlyle, the slavery apologist whose anti-democracy tract Shooting Niagara hinges on going over a waterfall into unknowable abyss, Yarvin recoils at Walt Whitman's democratic optimism, mocking his vision of a vast and sane and recurrent ebb and tide action for those floods of the great deep that have henceforth palpably burst forever their old bounds. The mass movement of people, the floods of the great deep, is reframed not as liberatory but as catastrophic. Finally, we have the fear that focuses around the connection between wetness and the feminine. This is a constant refrain in the work of Jordan Peterson, who frequently uses water symbolism to represent chaos, which he associates with the feminine in opposition to order or the masculine.
You have order, father, chaos, mother.
His discussions of flood myths and the chaotic unknown draw on similar fears of boundary dissolution. Ben Shapiro's notorious aversion to wetness perfectly exemplifies this conservative fear of dissolution and boundary loss.
Darling, it's better down where it's wetter. Take it from me.
It's no coincidence that this season's unraveling begins during the full moon party, a moment when the moon's gravitational influence creates the highest tides. Throughout human history, these lunar-driven tidal extremes have been associated with liminality and transformation. The party setting at this tidal peak creates the perfect conditions for power reshuffling and the breakdown of artificial boundaries. As an aside, the full moon party itself represents a perfect example of cultural collision and commodification like we discussed in our discussion of colonialism. It's a Western import, started in the 1980s by a group of backpackers. While the full moon holds sacred significance in Thai Buddhist tradition, a time for temple visits, meditation, and merit-making, Western tourists transformed it into something entirely different. What Thai culture views as a spiritually significant moment in the lunar cycle, Western tourism repackaged as an occasion for hedonistic revelry. Okay, back to water. The prominence of water imagery in the White Lotus connects to what Freud called the oceanic feeling, a sensation of limitlessness and connection to something greater than oneself. In Civilization and Its Discontents, Freud describes this as a feeling of indissoluble bond, of being one with the external world as a whole. This concept bears striking resemblance to the romantic sublime, that overwhelming sense of awe and transcendence in the face of nature's vastness that painters like J.M.W. Turner tried to capture in their work. Yet this same romantic tradition that celebrated the sublime also produced works that romanticized colonialism and slavery. These artistic traditions embodied what scholars call the colonial picturesque, a visual language that transforms sites of conquest and exploitation into aesthetically pleasing landscapes that naturalize Western dominance. The colonial picturesque depicted enslaved people and indigenous inhabitants as harmonious elements within these landscapes rather than victims of dispossession. Fran's post-Brazilian landscapes depicted enslaved people as small, contented figures within lush, paradise settings, effectively naturalizing slavery as a part of a harmonious tropical order, such as this image of Brazilians, quote-unquote, working in a sugar mill. Similarly, the Hudson River School painters like Thomas Cole and Albert Bierstadt created sweeping vistas of American wilderness that embodied manifest destiny while erasing indigenous presence and claims to the land. These artistic traditions use beauty to justify conquest, presenting colonized landscapes as naturally awaiting Western improvement. The tension between oceanic transcendence and colonial consumption creates a profound contradiction for the wealthy Western tourist. They simultaneously seek dissolution of the self through connection with authentic cultures and require the maintenance of strict boundaries to protect their privileged position. This explains why water becomes such a potent symbol in the series. It represents both the transcendence guests seek and the revolutionary force that threatens to dissolve the very boundaries their privilege depends on. The setting of Season 3 in Thailand carries particular significance in relation to water imagery, as Thailand was one of the countries devastated by the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami that killed around 230,000 people across a dozen countries. From the Sumerian epic of Ziusudra to the epic of Gilgamesh and countless indigenous flood myths worldwide, water becomes the instrument through which cosmic order is restored and human wickedness punished. The Genesis flood stands as perhaps the most culturally influential of these narratives. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created, for I regret that I have made them. Genesis 6:5-7. The Thai Buddhist setting of Season 3 adds another layer to the water symbolism. In Buddhist philosophy, water exemplifies anicca, or impermanence, the understanding that all phenomena are in constant flux. When Lachlan becomes obsessed with tsunami footage, or Victoria dreams of massive waves engulfing the resort, tsunami! On one level, this represents their repressed anxieties about the impending end to their privilege, which they seem to sense. But these are not just personal anxieties, but reminders of a fundamental truth that capitalism attempts to deny: the impermanence of all structures, including social and economic hierarchies. While Buddhism emphasizes water's natural flow as a teacher of non-attachment, baptism represents perhaps the most influential water ordeal in Western culture, explicitly framing immersion as symbolic death and rebirth, essentially a controlled drowning and resurrection. Christian theology makes this connection explicit. We were buried with him through baptism into death in order that we too may live a new life, Romans 6:4. While modern baptism is often a tame ritual, it originated as a radical act that dissolves social boundaries. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus, Galatians 3:28. This prefigured water's revolutionary potential. In early Christian communities, the baptismal ritual temporarily suspended social distinctions. Masters and slaves would be baptized in the same waters, wearing the same simple white garments, and addressed with the same language of kinship. Anti-capitalist media often uses water imagery positively, as a force that dissolves artificial boundaries, hierarchies, and rigid structures imposed by capitalism. Perhaps the most iconic American exploration of water as both revolutionary force and capitalist critique is Melville's Moby Dick. The novel portrays the whaling industry, one of America's first global capitalist ventures, as a site of exploitation where sailors from diverse backgrounds are united in dangerous labor that enriches distant shareholders. Captain Ahab's monomaniacal pursuit of the white whale represents capitalism's irrational drive towards endless accumulation and conquest, even at the cost of self-destruction. When the Pequod is finally destroyed by Moby Dick, with only Ishmael surviving, we see water reclaiming its power over human attempts to commodify nature. Though, if we're being honest, the true apotheosis of using water to critique capitalism might be SpongeBob, a literal bottom dweller who lives in a pineapple while his boss, Mr. Krabs, ruthlessly exploits his labor at the Krusty Krab. But y'all aren't ready for that conversation. The drowning archetype. The last 2 seasons of The White Lotus have featured water deaths, and let's be honest, even though Armand didn't drown, he did die in a bathtub. Drowning featured heavily in Succession as well, in which a central event is the drowning of the waiter for which Kendall feels responsible, as well as the drowning of some of the victims of rape from the Waystar cruise line. In Severance, Keir Egan drowned his twin brother as a punishment for wantonness in Woe's Hollow, the same place where Irving tries to drown Helena Egan. The opening credits of Season 2 depict a sinking car crashed into a lake, and when Gemma is asked if she would rather drown or suffocate, she chooses drowning. In Industry, the central event of Season 3 is the drowning death of Yasmin's father off the side of his yacht after it is revealed that he has been financially and sexually abusive towards her. This connection between drowning and haunting has deep cultural roots. In numerous pre-modern traditions, death by water creates particularly restless spirits. Korean folklore, which directly influenced Parasite's basement-dwelling ghost, holds that drowned individuals become gwishin, or ghosts, whose souls linger in pain and seek retribution. These traditions suggest that the drowned do not simply die, they transform into persistent embodiments of moral debt unpaid. The concept of drowning being a form of unclean death, grouped with death in childbirth or the suicide of the jilted pregnant woman, which leads the soul to linger and seek vengeance, also exists in Japanese culture, funo-yurei, boat spirits, Greco-Roman culture, naiads, Scottish-Irish culture, biennige, washerwomen spirits washing blood from the clothing of soon-to-die people in bodies of water, Chinese shui gui, water ghosts, also called water monkeys, Slavic rusalka, women who committed suicide in hot bodies of water, and in Caribbean culture, mamiwata connected to the bodies of water that carried slave ships. As some of these examples hint at, drowning has a historical relationship with revenge and retribution on the part of the underclass, women, and slaves, which is part of the reason it is chosen as a symbol throughout literature to illustrate these themes, such as in Toni Morrison's Beloved or Kate Chopin's The Awakening. In the stunning 1966 film Black Girl, the protagonist protests against her life as a servant to a white French family by committing suicide in their bathtub. Even Armand's death in The White Lotus is visually composed as a bathtub death, evoking Jacques-Louis David's revolutionary painting The Death of Marat, which depicted the aftermath of the murder of Marat, a radical journalist who advocated for the working class. The visual parallel isn't accidental. This iconic image of revolutionary martyrdom has been referenced across art and cinema, including in Fight Club and The Godfather, and more recently in TV shows like Sharp Objects and Euphoria. By placing Armand's body in the bathtub, White transforms a hotel manager into a symbolic martyr in the class warfare playing out across the resort, aestheticizing his death as a revolutionary tableau that silently indicts the system that produced it. Shakespeare's Ophelia represents perhaps the most iconic literary example of a woman transformed through drowning. In Hamlet, her watery death comes after she has already experienced a form of social death through rejection, madness, implied pregnancy out of wedlock, and the loss of her father, through whom she had social recognition. She haunts the remainder of the play, becoming a kind of moral witness whose death indicts the corrupt court of Elsinore. This meaning of Ophelia is used by Lars von Trier in his film Melancholia to comment upon depression and how its symptom of lack of productivity and emotional availability can actually be rebellious in the face of social norms. Drowning was further connected to these marginalized groups during witch hunts in which women, and often poor women, were subjected to tests like the ordeal by water or witch swimming, in which they were tied up and thrown in water to see if they would sink or float.
Float, throw her into the pool!
This was done explicitly as a punishment for rebelling against gender norms. Commentators have noticed that the Ratliff siblings' names, Lachlan, Saxon, and Piper,
Piper, Little Miss Peter, Piper, Pick and Pepper, I'm so tired of your tired asshole,
evoke the Pied Piper story, potentially positioning Piper as a false prophet.
So, a town in Hamelin, Germany was overrun with rats, and they paid a man, a piper, who is dressed in colorful clothing to rid the town of their rat infestation. Using a magical flute, the piper played an enchanting melody and lured the rats into the river where they drowned. But when the townspeople refused to pay him, he lured the townspeople's children into the river with, again, playing the flute, an enchanted melody, and they went into the river and they drowned.
This tale is centrally concerned with broken promises and watery punishment. Women of color in the colonies who were accused of witchcraft, heathenry, or devil worship for their traditional religious practices were also subjected to forced baptisms. In Jamaica and other Caribbean islands, there are accounts of enslaved people being suspected of practicing obeah or African-derived spiritual practices being subjected to tests similar to European witch swimming. Drowning itself was used as a form of punishment or execution in some colonial contexts, particularly for enslaved people suspected of rebellion or practicing traditional religions. In 1803, a group of Igbo slaves drowned themselves off the coast of Georgia rather than be sold into slavery. Drowning was used as a punishment during the transatlantic slave trade. Captains would sometimes have rebellious enslaved people thrown overboard as examples to prevent further resistance. One of the most important symbols of the abolitionist movement was the massacre on the slave ship Zong, in which British slavers pushed over 130 enslaved Africans off the ship to their deaths in order to collect insurance money for the slaves as lost property. This led to the landmark court case Gregson v. Gilbert, which the court initially ruled that the insurers had to pay for the lost cargo. This was one of several such cases of slaves being drowned, none of which led to charges of murder, but which were all handled as property law cases, until 1791 when the British Parliament passed a law disallowing insurance collection on the lives of slaves, a hard-fought win for the abolitionist movement. This horrific incident has reverberated through centuries of artistic representation. J.M.W. Turner's The Slave Ship transformed the atrocity into a haunting vision of the blood-red waters and drowning bodies that forced Victorian viewers to confront slavery's brutal reality. Contemporary artist Kara Walker's Salvation continues this tradition of bearing witness through her silhouette depicting a drowning figure. These visual reckonings with slavery's victims are also reflected in Afrofuturist imagination through the Drexciya myth, which reimagines the underwater world as a site of rebirth rather than only destruction. This mythology proposes that pregnant African women thrown overboard by slavers gave birth undersea, creating a new underwater civilization, transforming sites of colonial violence into spaces of revolutionary possibility. Thailand, home of the White Lotus Season 3, happens to be the most publicized country in which modern-day slaves die by drowning. Most of the workers in the Thai fishing industry, which supplies seafood to the US and EU markets, are trafficked workers from whose documents are stolen, who are worked about 17 to 24 hours per day, regularly beaten, and not permitted to leave. One report by the United Nations Interagency Project on Human Trafficking found that 59% of trafficked migrants interviewed aboard Thai fishing vessels reported witnessing the murder of a fellow worker. As one victim of trafficking stated, they would torture and murder the fishers, then throw them into the sea. They abused the crew in many ways, beating, hitting, and killing out on the ocean. I witnessed murder with my own eyes. Similarly, the world has witnessed drownings of migrants and refugees from the Mediterranean to the Rio Grande, such as the image that shocked the world of Ilan Kurdi.
Ilan Kurdi was 3 years old when he lost his life crossing the Mediterranean Sea to Europe.
Those who die at sea are still the victims of rapacious capitalism, which adds to the symbolic meaning in shows like The White Lotus, which heavily feature class tensions leading to watery deaths. Okay, this has gotten super dark. Lorazepam break.
When are you taking my lorazepam?
Lorazepam. International waters. Every season of The White Lotus takes place on an island, whereas many of the other shows with narratives critical of capitalism we've been discussing take place on islands or yachts as well. Islands and yachts are both symbols of extraterritoriality, or the attempt to flee legal obligations. Yachts can be registered under flags of convenience in countries with minimal taxation, labor protections, or environmental regulations. This allows owners to navigate global waterways while strategically avoiding jurisdictions with more stringent laws. Private islands and island nations have become notorious as tax havens and regulatory shelters where the wealthy can structure their affairs to minimize obligations. Yacht ownership structures are notoriously complex, often involving shell companies in island tax havens, making them effective vehicles for avoiding taxation. The irony of seeking refuge from social responsibility in places definitionally surrounded by water represents perhaps the most perfect metaphor for capitalism's inherent contradictions. The yacht or island, symbols of ultimate escape from social obligation, float precariously on or within the very element that throughout history and mythology has represented dissolution, judgment, and the return of the repressed. Perhaps this is why people around the world experience schadenfreude upon seeing the wealthy aboard their yachts being attacked by orcas, or billionaires dying deep underwater in a submarine. Like King Canute commanding the tides to halt, the wealthy retreat to these water-bound sanctuaries in a futile attempt to assert control over forces fundamentally beyond human containment. Perhaps the ultimate expression of this attempted escape from social obligation while remaining surrounded by water is the Seasteading movement, popularized by Silicon Valley billionaires and libertarian thinkers. Seasteading represents the logical conclusion of the yacht and the private island. Permanent floating communities deliberately positioned beyond national jurisdictions to create new societies with minimal regulation and taxation. The Seasteading Institute, co-founded in 2008 by PayPal co-founder Peter Thiel and Patrick Friedman, grandson of Milton Friedman, promotes the vision of autonomous floating cities that would allow for experimenting with new forms of governance, similar to the ultra-libertarian underwater society created by businessman Andrew Ryan in the BioShock series. Perhaps the most profound contradiction in the Seasteading vision lies in its unconscious psychological resonance with the womb. The original enclosed protected space surrounded by fluid, as pointed out by TikTok creator Cy Cantarell.
The longing for total autonomy and control, especially inside of a space that's completely self-contained, isolated from external threats or pressures or uncertainty, where all needs are met without any struggle, is oftentimes, in psychoanalysis, a longing for a return to the womb. So a pre-subjective state where everything is given to one without having to go through any type of struggle to attain it.
What these predominantly male technologists are imagining, in essence, is a technological recreation of the womb experience. A perfectly controlled environment where everything is provided without reciprocal obligation, where one exists in isolation save for the presence of service staff, predominantly women in places like the White Lotus, whose sole purpose is to anticipate and fulfill needs without making demands of their own.
Pleasant, interchangeable helpers.
While explicitly celebrating independence and freedom from social constraints, the seasteading fantasy thus implicitly seeks a return to the most dependent state humans ever experience, floating in amniotic fluid, completely reliant on an external provider, protected from all challenge and all responsibility. The sovereign individual reveals himself as secretly desiring the opposite of sovereignty, a return to the perfect infantile dependency, with the provider changing from mother to technology and service workers. Early seasteading projects have already confronted this contradiction between fantasy and reality. The much publicized attempt by the Blue Frontiers to build a floating island in French Polynesia collapsed when local Tahitians protested against what they perceived as a new form of colonialism. Wealthy foreigners seeking to exploit their waters while contributing little to local communities. The project faced the reality that there is no true international waters free from claims, histories, and moral obligations. Sorry if the flop Tropica girlies felt like they were catching strays during this section. I love you guys. Season 3 title sequence offers perhaps the most explicit visual metaphor for the show's thesis about capitalism's doomed attempt to escape moral consequences. The stylized frames depict wealthy passengers aboard a luxury vessel, adorned in period costumes suggesting colonial-era opulence. They are being attacked by sea monsters as their ship sinks into turbulent waters. This imagery brilliantly condenses the show's central themes into a visual prologue that viewers encounter before each episode. This vessel, like the White Lotus resorts themselves, represents capitalism's attempt to create floating sanctuaries of privilege detached from territorial obligations. Yet as the sequence progresses, this illusion of sanctuary collapses. Monstrous tentacles emerge from the depths, wrapping around the passengers and dragging them into the sea. The ship itself begins to sink, its structure compromised by forces it cannot control. The visual style of these images deliberately evokes colonial-era maritime paintings and engravings that celebrated Western dominance of global trade routes. Yet by introducing monstrous elements, the sequence subverts this triumphalist colonial aesthetic. Where historical maritime art often portrayed non-Western peoples and nature as resources to be controlled or exotic backdrops for the European adventure, the title sequence inverts this relationship. Nature, in the form of sea monsters and overwhelming waves, reasserts dominance over the colonial enterprise. Similarly, at the end of the Season 2 title sequence, a fountain can be seen to overflow. This also recalls the painting in the Season 2 finale of Severance, in which all of the characters are depicted as standing in floodwaters, which I would interpret as Lumen trying to appropriate the change imagery to symbolize the new technology they hope to perfect. As an aside, Cristobal Tapia de Vere's score does a similar thing sonically that these title images do visually.
Going into tribal sounds, percussions, and all that. With time, I started realizing why I went into that, because it's not about Hawaii, about local music. It's not about anything like that. It just feels like somehow the tourists could be savages. You could be confused because it's like tourists get into a wild place and this is a vibe. You hear animals and tribal things and whatnot. But maybe the music is not about Hawaii. Maybe it's not about. It's about these people that are acting like savages. Maybe the music is mocking them sometimes.
He employs throat singing, ritualistic chanting, and primal vocalizations that evoke pre-modern ceremonial practices while deliberately distorting them. The score's deliberate dissonance, with its slipping rhythms and distorted harmonies, creates the same uneasy sensation as the threshold crossing we've been examining throughout this analysis. It places listeners in a liminal auditory space where familiar cultural markers are present but purposefully decontextualized. There are floods and water overflowing in the last title card in each season's opening credits. We see the flood or overflowing image, and then the White Lotus emerging as the title of the show comes right after. This relates to the ecology of the lotus, which grows in flood waters. But the lotus is also the water lily, traditionally depicted alongside the drowned woman archetype that we have learned about. The lotus floats pristinely above the muck, like the resort floats in a realm of wealth above the muck of history and class relations. But lotuses go underwater each night, similar to how we encounter the subconscious realm when we dream, and re-emerge each morning. This is mirrored in several lines of dialogue about being born anew each day, such as in Season 1 in Belinda's spiritual session with Tanya, and in Mark's monologue after he finds out he doesn't have cancer. And in this season, with the talk about being reborn into life moment by moment in the Buddhist sense.
Every moment, I'm being born into this life.
It's also a reminder to look at things in a new way. And if you do, then every day can be a new day, right? And if it is, it's like you're always being born into life. Like all the time. You're not stuck.
When you're born, you are like a single drop of water flying upward. You die. You land back into the water, become one with the ocean.
This seems to be the central theme of the show, and White has been described as an eternal optimist. But the fact that the symbol of rebirth is also one that is connected with revolutionary images of the drowned woman and floods of retribution shows that the optimism is one based on the sense that natural cycles have power and that the wronged don't disappear. This is possibly part of the reason behind climate denial, an attempt to repress the threatening reality of sea level rise, among other examples of out-of-control nature. When characters in White Lotus, Industry, or Triangle of Sadness meet watery ends, these deaths represent more than plot conveniences. They symbolize capitalism confronting the very forces it has tried to externalize or deny. This pattern speaks to a deeper cultural recognition that even the most sophisticated systems of avoidance eventually confront their boundaries. The tax haven, the offshore account, the luxury vessel, the seastead, all exist in a relationship of denied dependency with the very forces they attempt to escape. In this way, water in these narratives serves not just as a setting or a plot device, but as a metaphor for historical reckoning itself, for the inevitable return of that which has been suppressed, denied, or exploited. Water's natural tendency to find its level provides another dimension of its revolutionary symbolism. Unlike other elements that can be stacked, contained, or shaped to reflect hierarchy, water inexorably seeks equilibrium, distributing itself evenly across space when unrestrained. This physical property made it the perfect metaphor for pre-modern hospitality systems that sought to level guests and hosts, as reflected in the etymology of ghosty itself. Capitalism's attempts to create artificial boundaries against this leveling force through luxury resorts built on beaches or yachts floating above the depths represent a fundamental denial of water's essential nature.
Part 5. Capitalism on the Couch. Part 5. Capitalism on the Couch. By examining the psychological underpinnings of economic concepts, we can better understand why the White Lotus functions as a critique of modern tourism and hospitality, not just by exposing exploitation, but by dramatizing capitalism's deeper irrationalities, anxieties, and repressed contradictions. Adam Smith's famous metaphor for capitalism, the invisible hand, comes directly from Shakespeare's Macbeth. Be innocent of the knowledge, dearest Chuck, till thou applaud the deed. Come, sealing night, scarf up the tender eye of pitiful day, and with thy bloody and invisible hand cancel and tear to pieces that great bond which keeps me pale. Smith transforms this nocturnal, violent image into the cornerstone of economic liberalism. In The Wealth of Nations, he writes,
intends only his own gain, and he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. By pursuing his own interests, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it.
This transformation from Macbeth's bloody hand to a benevolent, invisible force reveals much about capitalism's psychological foundations. As Nicholas Medina Mora has argued, the notion that capitalism is not the product of a specific arrangement of historical forces, but rather the natural culmination of the development of the human mind, rests on the premise that while people don't know what they do, or even why they want what they want, the sum of their individual actions organically result in a social order that, however imperfect, is preferable to all known alternatives. Marx pioneered the approach of analyzing the psychoanalytic dimensions of economics by describing capitalists as vampires who suck the living labor from workers, a metaphor that goes beyond rhetorical flourish to reveal something fundamental about capitalism's relationship to life and death. This vampiric imagery connects to what Mark Fisher and others have noted about the undead nature of the corporate form. Corporations are entities that cannot die natural deaths, that possess inhuman longevity, and feed on living labor to sustain themselves. The corporation, like the vampire, represents a distortion of the natural life cycle, accumulating power beyond human limits while being governed by an inhuman drive towards endless growth. As Katharina Pistor argues in The Code of Capital, the corporate form was first innovated in ancient Rome through the concept of the slave-run firm, a legal loophole in which a person would place their wealth in the ownership of a slave who they themselves owned, thereby shielding assets from liability. This created the first legal shell entities, built on the backs of people who are legally considered shells of persons, what Orlando Patterson calls social death. The contemporary financial system offers particularly rich examples of how economic structures mirror psychological repression. Offshore finance and shadow banking function as capitalism's economic unconscious, spaces where disavowed transactions can occur outside public view while remaining essential to the system's functioning, just as the individual psyche represses unacceptable desires. The global economy pushes its most exploitative or destabilizing activities into regulatory shadows. What's repressed in these shadow zones inevitably returns in the form of financial crises that erupt seemingly from nowhere. Much like symptoms of psychological repression, this perspective helps explain why economic behavior so often deviates from rational actor models. Financial bubbles operate as collective delusions that mimic Freudian repression. Markets become irrational, exuberant, or manic before the bubble bursts, releasing repressed reality. Season 3 of The White Lotus offers a perfect case study of capitalism's psychological architecture through the Ratliff family, where the three siblings function as living embodiments of Freud's tripartite model of the psyche. Saxon, with his unbridled appetite for status, sex, and power, represents capitalism's id, the raw, pleasure-seeking impulses that drive accumulation without moral restraint.
Specie?
His character at the beginning of the season is reminiscent of Patrick Bateman's sociopathic materialism, demonstrating how capitalism valorizes these primitive drives, rewarding rather than restraining them. In contrast, Piper embodies the superego. She is drawn to Buddhism and spiritual questioning, explicitly rejecting the family's values and critiquing tourism as Disneyland for rich bohemians. Between these two forces stands the youngest brother, Lachlan, as the ego, attempting to navigate reality by partly identifying with each sibling. Their dynamic reveals how capitalism's psychological contradictions play out within interpersonal relationships. When the family is forced to surrender their phones, cutting ties with the outside world, these psychological tensions can no longer be externalized or mediated through technology, forcing a confrontation with repressed realities. The siblings thus demonstrate Freud's insight that the psyche is a system of tensions rather than a harmonious whole. Much like capitalism itself, which requires constant repression of its contradictions to maintain the illusion of functional stability, the revelation of sexual contact between Saxon and Lachlan during the full moon party illustrates what happens when the partitions between different aspects of the self dissolve completely. Unlike Frank, whose exploration of desire through external mirrors offers potential integration, Saxon's rigid sense of self cannot accommodate this boundary collapse. His subsequent crash out demonstrates capitalism's fundamental anxiety about dissolution. When compartmentalization fails, the entire system is thrown into periodic crises. Lastly, and most on the nose of all, there's something deeply revealing about the fact that one of the wealthiest characters in the show, billionaire Greg/Gary, has a sexual fantasy that involves reenacting his childhood trauma. As Chloe explains, he grew up overhearing his parents having sex. Now, as an adult, he gets turned on by the idea of walking in on his partner with another man so he can vanquish and replace the intruder.
You guys ever watch each other have sex?
In other words, he wants to recreate the very situation that made him feel powerless as a child, but this time with him in control. This is straight out of Freud. In psychoanalysis, the hallmark of maturation is resolution of the Oedipal complex, the ability to let go of this type of infantile desire. But what happens when someone can't let it go? Or when the social world around them actually rewards the never-ending competitive urge? This is where capitalism comes in. In a world that is built on constant growth, endless competition, and the need to always be striving for more, the desire to replace the father, to surpass the previous generation, to dominate others, to always win, never has to end. In fact, it becomes the engine that drives the whole system. Gary's fantasy is a metaphor for this. He wants to rerun the script of childhood shame and excitement and flip the outcome. This drive is not about healing, it's about compulsive repetition. And because it can never fully succeed, since the father is gone and the past can't be changed, it becomes a loop. He can do the fantasy over and over, but it doesn't resolve the feeling underneath. Now compare that to Rick. He's on a similar journey. He wants justice for his father, a man killed by a powerful real estate developer. Throughout the season, Rick can't let go of the story and the identity he's built around this wound. Like Gary, his life is structured around reliving the past, not integrating it. The connection between these two men is very important. They're stuck in cycles of male grievance, haunted by a father figure, consumed by the idea of rewriting history, and unable to find peace. And both stories point towards something bigger about capitalism. Because if you think about it, capitalism doesn't just reward ambition, it depends on it never ending. There is no enough. You always need to grow your company, beat last quarter's numbers, improve your brand, expand your influence. In that way, capitalism mirrors these characters' unresolved issues. The drive to accumulate, whether money, power, status, doesn't come from rational needs for survival or human flourishing. At a certain point, it's accumulation for accumulation's sake. This comes from a deeper psychological structure, the need to finally win a rivalry that can't be won, which is what makes Rick's comments that life is about knowing when to stop so insightful. He also recognizes this when he sees that the father, the bogeyman of childhood, has become old and frail as he one day will be, which for him finally breaks the illusion of the need to overcome this adversary. There's also the aspect of Greg/Gary's fantasy that he is reclaiming his mother, and for Rick that he is avenging or protecting her. This is not necessarily their literal mothers, but what the mother often symbolizes in psychoanalysis: wholeness and interdependence. The mother represents the feeling that you are already enough. This is the force that attempts to balance out the relentless striving. You can see characters like Saxon and Lachlan turn to women for alternatives to their father's values. For example, they're seeking this maternal principle of sufficiency and interconnection that might free them from their loops of competition and striving, even if they don't consciously understand that that's what they're looking for. And as an aside, I just want to be clear that the concept of the maternal principle has a complicated relationship with gender essentialism that I don't really have time to get into in this video, but it can be cleaved away from concepts like being in your feminine energy that are currently poisoning people's brains. But I'm not endorsing that type of nonsense here by talking about what the mother represents symbolically in psychoanalysis. Okay, so without that influence of the maternal principle, this psychological loop, powered by unresolved desire and rooted in wounded masculinity, ends up playing out on a global scale. This is a hallmark of the current renaissance we're seeing in anti-capitalist prestige media. Succession is practically a case study in unresolved Oedipal desire. Logan Roy is the ultimate patriarch, a self-made titan who takes power not just over the company, but over his children's entire psychological landscape. Each child, but especially Kendall, is trapped in that Freudian loop: desire to please the father, desire to overthrow the father, fear of becoming the father, inability to be free of the father. Kendall's arc is a slow-motion car crash of Oedipal energy. He wants to win his father's approval and destroy him, but he can't do either fully. So he keeps trying, keeps failing, keeps repeating. Like Gary and Rick, he is stuck in a cycle of male grievance and symbolic rivalry. It's worth noting that this kind of unresolved Oedipal structure, male grievance, wounded pride, fixation on paternal displacement, doesn't just drive capitalism. In other contexts, historical ones, it has powered fascism. I'm here thinking about Karl Ove Knausgaard's final volume of My Struggle, where he not only unpacks his own psychic entanglement with his own father, but spends over 1,000 pages analyzing Hitler's original My Struggle as evidence that Hitler's own relationship with his father powered his world-altering psychological issues. But while the White Lotus is not really interested in fascism per se, it does sketch the preconditions, the psychic raw material that fascism later exploits. So that's probably a topic for another video. This Oedipal psychological dynamic we have been discussing isn't just fiction, it maps onto real-world billionaire behavior. Take Elon Musk. His estrangement from his father, Errol Musk, is well documented. Musk has called him a terrible human being, yet talked openly about trying to prove himself despite that. And let's be clear, he is a terrible human being. Exhibit A, he's married to Elon's stepsister. So Elon's family history is also marked with real incest, not play-acted or symbolic stuff like actually grooming one's own child. The irony for Elon is that even as he publicly rejects his father, he's perpetually caught in what we have talked about here as an apparent Oedipal loop, overperforming, overposting, overcompensating. He's not just building rockets, he's trying to become a godlike figure whose reach exceeds the father's in every way. The same person who bullied him, calling him fat, blaming his child's death on him publicly, and saying out-of-pocket shit to the press like he had no friends growing up, also has a really intense pro-natalist ideology that the point of life is to reproduce and constantly puts pressure on his son Elon to have more kids. And Elon hates his dad, but also like he actually does this. It's literally so Kendall Roy coded. Donald Trump's story actually follows the same pattern with a deeply ambivalent relationship with his father, Fred Trump, who is reportedly controlling, emotionally cold, and fixated on dominance. Trump Sr. is often credited with shaping Donald Trump's obsession with winning, appearance, and humiliation. Trump's own language about being a killer, about other people being losers, and his compulsive need for affirmation reads like a textbook case of unresolved paternal rivalry turned into public performance, as was beautifully dramatized in the recent film The Apprentice. And in that film, they really drove the point home in scenes between Donald and Trump Sr. that he both hated his dad and yet still wanted to show him up. And that push-pull of contradictory emotions is really the motor of the psychic drive towards accumulation, in this case of power for its own sake, that we've been discussing here. It's also extremely evident in the way that he eventually enacts humiliation against his surrogate father figure, Roy Cohn, when he's dying from AIDS.
Even scary. I mean, look at him. It's not exactly a face you want to bring home to your mother, am I right?
And we can now see that pattern repeating with his own sons, who have all reportedly controlled and managed their partner's physical appearance to meet the desires of their father, with Donald Trump Jr. even repeatedly replacing his girlfriend with someone he thought would impress his dad more. The rest of the broligarchy, Bezos, Zuck, Thiel, all similarly showcase a relentless drive and desire to conquer industries. Their techno-utopian fantasies like colonizing space or uploading consciousness suggest an inability to accept limits, mortality, loss, dependence, all things traditionally associated with the mother. Across all 3 seasons, The White Lotus returns to this fractured father-son relationship theme, not just as family melodrama, but as symbolic dramas of masculinity. In Season 1, Mark's discovery that his father was secretly gay shatters the patriarchal fantasy he had inherited, and he only regains a fragile sense of masculinity through performative violence, reaffirming a heteronormative ideal. In Season 2, Albie begins as a feminist ally, disavowing his father's and grandfather's sexism, but ultimately sells out his mother in order to re-enter the masculine lineage, replicating the very patterns he condemned. These arcs reflect how patriarchal capitalism structures desire, inheritance, and even morality, where becoming a man often requires a betrayal of the feminine, and where masculinity must be violently reasserted when its unstable foundations are exposed. What makes The White Lotus so compelling is how it shows the characters' private psychological dramas playing out through global systems of power and exploitation.
suggesting that the path beyond capitalism might require us to resolve not just economic contradictions, but the psychological patterns that sustain them.
Conclusion. Mark Fisher, in Capitalist Realism, Is There No Alternative?, defines capitalist realism as the pervasive belief that capitalism is not just the dominant economic system, but the only conceivable one. Under capitalist realism, even anti-capitalist critiques are often absorbed back into the system, rendered as entertainment, aestheticized into temporary outrage, or turned into consumer products. This raises a key question. Does the White Lotus challenge capitalist realism, or does it reinforce it by portraying capitalism's contradictions without presenting an alternative? Aristotle's Poetics suggests that tragedy produces catharsis, a way to process social contradictions without destabilizing the system. Similarly, in The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche argued that tragedy can function as a pressure valve, releasing collective anxiety while preventing real disruption. Raymond Williams, however, argues that tragedy contains more radical possibilities. While The White Lotus emerges amid what some critics have termed an oversaturated, eat-the-rich genre, alongside works like The Menu, Saltburn, Triangle of Sadness, and Blink Twice, its approach to capitalist critique operates on multiple symbolic registers that distinguish it from more direct or didactic examples. Rather than simply depicting wealthy people behaving badly and receiving comeuppance, White offers a more complex examination of how capitalism has transformed our moral frameworks, colonized our psychological landscapes, and violated ancient codes of reciprocity. This explains why many leftists and critics of capitalism find the show so captivating despite its focus on the wealthy. In Season 1, it's Armand who pays the ultimate price, not Shane. This asymmetry provides what Frederick Jameson would call a contradictory symbolic resolution, one that doesn't satisfy our desire for justice, but rather illustrates the reality of how capitalism functions. In Jameson's analysis, this represents a narrative solution that appears to resolve a social problem or contradiction at the level of storytelling, but does so in a way that actually reveals the irreconcilable nature of the underlying social contradiction. Tanya's death plays the same function, appearing to resolve her storyline, but in a way that highlights irreconcilable contradictions. Despite her wealth and privilege, Tanya cannot escape her psychological patterns, and even her moment of agency, fighting back against her would-be killers, leads to her accidental death. The resolution contradictorily suggests both individual agency and systemic entrapment. This form of contradictory symbolic resolution appears across contemporary media critiquing capitalism. Succession's finale offers perhaps the quintessential example. After 4 seasons documenting the Roy family's toxic battles for control of their media empire, the series concludes with none of the Roy siblings inheriting their father's kingdom. Instead, the company is sold to tech mogul Lucas Madsen, with Tom Wambsgans installed as the American CEO. This ending appears to resolve the central conflict, who will succeed Logan Roy, but does so in a way that reveals the unsolvable contradiction at the heart of capitalist succession. The system continues unchanged despite the change in personnel. What makes this resolution particularly contradictory is how it simultaneously suggests both the defeat of dynastic capitalism, the Roy children lose their birthright, and its ultimate triumph. Corporate power remains unchallenged, merely transferring to new hands. The water imagery that dominates the finale, Kendall staring into the bay, contemplating suicide, echoes the White Lotus's use of water as revolutionary force. Yet unlike Quinn in Season 1 of The White Lotus, who escapes into the ocean towards potential freedom, Kendall remains trapped at the water's edge, unable to escape the system that has formed him. This ending satisfies neither our desire for justice nor our hope for systemic change, instead forcing us to confront the persistent nature of capitalist power beyond individual actors. Both The White Lotus and Succession deploy these contradictory symbolic resolutions to avoid the falsely comforting narratives that conventional entertainment offers. Rather than providing the catharsis of seeing the wealthy punished or systems overthrown, they offer the more uncomfortable recognition that our current economic arrangements resist easy narrative resolution. This refusal of simple closure is precisely what makes these shows effective as social critique. They deny us the fantasy that capitalism's contradictions can be resolved through individual moral choices or karmic justice. Nonetheless, this convergence of water imagery across so many works and cultures suggests there is indeed a persistent undercurrent of resistance to capitalist logic embedded in our collective consciousness. What's particularly striking is how these patterns emerge organically across diverse creators, time periods, and cultural contexts. Writers and filmmakers aren't necessarily consciously coordinating these symbolic systems. They're tapping into something deeper that resonates across human experience. This reminds me of what Carl Jung might call a collective unconscious pattern.
I mean, every symbol has a meaning. It's the collective unconscious.
Or what Raymond Williams termed structures of feeling, ways of experiencing and responding to the world that haven't yet been fully articulated, but are nonetheless widely shared. These drowning and water symbols seem to function as a kind of cultural immune response to capitalism's attempt to redefine human nature solely in terms of self-interest and market relations. Throughout The White Lotus, the logic of supernatural retribution structures the show's narrative world, even as it remains grounded in realism. The idea that capitalism has violated ancient moral codes, whether through broken promises, exploitative hospitality, or ecological destruction, makes the deaths in The White Lotus feel inevitable, even mythic. This narrative strategy, which I've called haunted capitalism, does not simply critique capitalism in a direct political sense, but instead taps into a collective intuition that something about our current system is unresolved. By invoking supernatural forces, curses, symbolic retribution, haunted spaces, the show allows us to imagine a world where those tensions come to a head. The satisfaction of these stories does not come from a coherent moral resolution. Capitalist injustice rarely is corrected in these narratives, but from the way that they dramatize contradictions we sense but cannot articulate in everyday life. This helps explain why shows and movies like Parasite, Triangle of Sadness, Succession, and Severance continually return to liminality, ritual, and haunting as organizing principles. Even if we no longer believe in curses, divine justice, or the mythic retribution of violated hospitality, we still find satisfaction in seeing these forces play out within an otherwise realist world. These narratives do not present an alternative system, nor do they suggest that reviving pre-capitalist moralities would resolve capitalism's contradictions. Instead, they expose how the past lingers within the present, not as a model to be restored, but as a sign of capitalism's incomplete transformation of social life. Even as capitalism naturalizes itself as just human nature, recurring symbolic patterns tell a different story. They suggest that something in us resists this logic, that whether through myth, narrative, or the structure of our collective unconscious, we continue to seek ways to imagine capitalism's contradictions dissolving.